Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Elliott, and welcome to the MKRC. The purpose of the Research Consortium is to help you develop the ability to communicate research effectively. I'm sure you've given lots of presentations before, but regardless of whether or not they were research presentations, it's always good to go over the basics. This year, we'll be having 20 to 25 minutes to present with 5 minutes for questions, and it's not a lot of time to cover some of the complex materials you might be presenting. So, before you start making your presentations, I'd like to give some pointers on what I think you should include in your presentation and how it should be included. The 4 topics that I'll address and that I think should be at the forefront of your minds as you're developing your presentation are the presentation's content, the formatting of your content, which will provide your presentation with flow, basic musts when making a PowerPoint, and additional tips that you should implement. When you are doing research, you undoubtedly referenced countless different papers and accumulated extensive data. However, you'll never be able to convey all of this information within your allotted time. Rather, your job as the presenter is to identify the key pieces of information that, when combined, convey a clear message that your audience will be able to grasp. To determine the information that you should include, first, highlight the message that you want your audience to leave with. Next, select only the data that explains and supports this idea and include it in your presentation. Despite the fact that you'll be conveying research, try organizing your thoughts in a narrative fashion. This chronological aspect will help the flow of your presentation, which will allow the audience to follow along with ease. Just like in a story, you'll have an exposition, which will be your introduction. In place of a story's rising action, you'll explain the method you use to reach your results or the climax. Discussion of the results will be your falling action, and the denouement of your research will be your conclusion and closing remarks. Start with the exposition, the introduction, and a research paper. In this section, the characters or important vocabulary and topics should be introduced. The setting, or what current studies are saying about these topics and their significance, should be described, and the conflict or the problems currently seen with these particular studies should be identified. Finally, you should make clear what question you specifically want to answer with your research. Next, you need to include methods. What was the experiment design? What tests were run or papers read to answer the question posed in the introduction? And why were these steps taken over other avenues? Providing reasoning for the steps taken to get to the results will allow the audience to understand the results themselves better. Make sure that you're always referring back to the main question to keep and maintain the focus of the presentation. Now it's time to show your results. This is the most important part of your presentation, so slow down and make it clear. When showing tables and figures, try to limit them to 1 to 2 per slide, or show them one by one, enlarging them so that they're easy to see. Use animations to emphasize parts of the image that show significant or relevant results. Finally, walk the audience through reading the figures. Don't assume that the audience can quickly read a figure or that it's intuitive. You've had time to pore over these figures, but they've not. Walk them through what you want them to read. Once the audience has grasped the results of your research, you can start talking about implications. Start by providing possible explanations for why the results were the way they were. Is there a possibility that an error in the data collection led to unreliable data? Put the results in context. What could this mean for future experiments or within the medical field, etc.? Tie in the setting or the scientific significance that you spoke to at the beginning of the presentation. How did the results affect what we knew at the beginning of the presentation? You'll end with a conclusion. In this section, you'll address whether the question that you posed in the introduction was answered and what future experiments are needed if it wasn't. If your question was answered clearly, reiterate what that answer was. Your goal in this section is to cleanly wrap up your presentation while providing an avenue for future research or implementation. This will be the end of your presentation, but before I end mine, I want to give you a few tips on what your PowerPoint should look like. We'll start with font, which could seem trivial, but it could really make or break a presentation. Make sure the font size is between 18 and 46. Use 18 for captions and 46 for titles. If your font is too big, it can be off-putting. Conversely, if your audience is squinting to make out the words on your slides, their attention will be drawn from what you're saying and they'll miss things. Text color could cause a similar issue. If the text is difficult to see on the background, the text you write is pointless and the audience won't be able to see anything. So keep that in mind when choosing text and background colors. Finally, avoid overly embellished or condensed fonts that are a little more difficult to read. It might look fine on the screen in front of you, but oftentimes when these fonts are thrown up onto larger screens, they're a little difficult to make out. In addition to font formatting, there are things to keep in mind when designing your slides. Help your audience organize the data you provide by designating one theme per slide, which should be clearly designated by the title. If the concept consists of a lot of information that starts to crowd up a slide, make subsections of that concept and use multiple slides. Any figures you use should be large. Use animations to draw your audience's attention to places that you want them to look on the figure. Finally, stick with a single color palette for the entirety of your presentation. Here's an example of an overcrowded slide. These graphs mark the level of cytokine and excitatory neurotoxins tested in CSF and blood in patients with mild, no, and severe neurotoxicity levels. There's some really good data on these graphs, but it would be lost on the audience because they can't see anything. So in the next slides, I'll show another way to present this data while allowing the audience to actually see everything. Show each graph one by one, allowing the figures to be enlarged, and include the information that you want the audience to take away from the graphs to the side. I've taken the notable graphs and enlarged them so that the audience is able to see the figure. In addition to sizing the figures, there are a couple of tips that are key in emphasizing points and keeping focus. These are mainly using animations and a pointer. So both animations and pointers, with them, you'll be able to direct your audience's attention. Secondly, you should establish transition sentences to guide the audience from one topic to another. Additionally, the tone of your voice matters when you're presenting. If you sound bored and uncomfortable, your audience will also feel bored and uncomfortable. Making eye contact during the presentation will make the audience feel more invested in your presentation. Finally, practice. This will make the biggest difference. So practice, practice, practice. All right, that's all I have for you today, everyone. If you have any questions or would like to set up a meeting for me to look over your presentations or to practice in front of someone, feel free to email me. I look forward to seeing your presentations.